Hi, everybody. Today's April 5, 2024. And I'm honored to have with me Steve Milloy, junkscience.com. Steve, tell us about yourself, your journey, and what is junk science?
Well, junk science is bad science that is used to advance a special agenda. Usually it's a hidden agenda. I've been working in this field for 33 years, I guess now. I have background in science and statistics. I'm also a lawyer, and it's just sort of the perfect background for what I fell into doing, which is trying to expose bad science when it's used for evil purposes. So it's not something you train for. It's just something I wound up doing because I've always been fascinated by the lying. And since I've been doing this, I have seen a lot more lying in science than truth telling. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I posted on Twitter today, totally coincidentally. I'm not going to be able to quote it, but my friend Daniel Jupp, whom I've had on previously, and he has a Substack, Jupplandia. He had a comment from a reader. I'm not going to get. Maybe I'll find it later. But basically, that science. It's not just politicians that can be bought out. Humans, being what they are, they're fallible, and scientists are not necessarily above the fray. But you seem to have uncovered a fair amount of this. And I'll just preface one other thing. I was at a lecture last night by Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, whom I greatly admire.
Right.
And he's at the forefront of the originally Missouri versus Biden, now it's Murthy versus Missouri case, wherein Doctors Fauci and Collins, amongst others, labeled the Great Barrington Declaration and the epidemiologists, medical doctor scientists involved, Kuldorf, Sunitra Gupta, and Jay Bhattacharya, as fringe epidemiologists. Went from those fringe institutions of Stanford, Harvard, and University of Oxford, England. And then they went on a smear campaign, and this is coming out, emerging in front of the Supreme Court, right right almost as we speak. He was there in front of hearings last week, and came out famously the Ketanji Brown Jackson quote that the First Amendment shouldn't really be used against government or something like that. Did you see that? Did you see that quote?
No.
Well, I can't do it justice. I captured some slides on my Twitter feed. We'll get to that later. But basically, he's coming to your point of view laterally. Jay is a very amazing man. He's a PhD in economics, I believe, an MD, and has done epidemiology. And he didn't go to Twitter, and he admired Dr. Collins, as a respectable scientist. And it's just kind of like the scales peeling from his eyes to see the incredible inside baseball stuff that's going on. Anyway, I apologize for that little discourse. But a lot of when I was reading your junk science article on radiation standards and I guess safety standards and so forth, it's just the kind of the back, the swampy background to it is very redolent of what we're seeing in this Murthy versus Missouri case, which I recommend people follow up on Twitter and whatnot. Sorry.
Yeah.
So carry on.
Well, so I actually sort of cut my teeth on debunking epidemiology because the vast majority of epidemiology is just junk scientists. The vast majority of epidemiologists are, as far as I'm concerned, fraudsters. I mean, there are good ones, and I think we saw some of them pop up during COVID. I don't think they necessarily realize how widespread and rampant the problem with epidemiology is, because they'll recognize it maybe in a medical context or in COVID, but they won't recognize it in the context of the environment. So I got into this because I wanted to be a securities lawyer, but the stock market kept having troubles. I kept losing my job. So I wound up getting hired by a guy that had a regulatory practice in Washington, D.C., and he hired me because I have a background in science and statistics, public health, and I was a lawyer. So we started working on EPA risk assessments, and I learned very quickly from EPA that epidemiology was just being completely abused. These just lousy data, being used to produce very weak associations and then coming up with these huge conclusions. And, radiation was one of them. Environmental tobacco smoke was another. I mean, there's just a whole range of this stuff. And then, I got hired by the Department of Energy to actually help them out fighting against EPA, because EPA was, wanted them to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on radiation cleanups that weren't necessary. And so just, one thing led from another. And, at the dawn of the internet, I started junkscience.com and have been doing it ever since.
Well, good for you. And I came across you because I've had this kind of little thing inside my head, aside from my brain, maybe next to within my brain someplace. And it was a little bit tweaked 2 days ago when I was walking around the neighborhood, and I saw a radon truck, radon company truck. I'm like, yeah, like what happened with that? My office medically, I had a medical practice for 30 years or so, and next door in the 80s into 90s was an asbestos abatement store, and so they had a bunch of very strange guys, very kind of coked up and drunk and whatnot kind of guys, go running through that place, and they were fixing the world. They're getting rid of asbestos, and both of those things had kind of their fad moments, their moment in the sun. They disappeared. And radon in particular, I never really saw the data showing that there had been some kind of blip in lung cancer because of radon, and or some diminution thereof with its mitigation, removal, and so forth. And I always thought it was a red herring. And I looked into I used these very same fingers to type into Twitter, and I found amongst the skeptics very few, and you talking about kind of radon, that episode as having been overblown, say. But I don't want to veer too far into that, unless you want to, because you did refer me to a paper about the standards that the government had been using for radiation safety, so forth. So you can pick a straw, which one you want to go down.
Well, just, on radon. So, radon was hugely controversial in the 80s and 90s. The epidemiology, once again, was terrible, weak associations, lousy data. The scare is largely based on epidemiologic study of underground uranium miners from, I believe, New Mexico, and they had a higher rate of lung cancer. Of course, well, these poor men were smokers. They worked in underground mines. They often slept there, very dusty environments. God knows what they were exposed to, and they had slightly higher rates of lung cancer. And then the EPA just extrapolated that using something called the linear no threshold models, which is the article you're talking about that I have at the top of Junk Science. They extrapolated that into, well, there's radon in basements, and therefore people have to mitigate the radon in basements. And I don't know about where you live, but where I live, the building code is you have to vent the radon from your basement outside your house. And this is just a scare. There has never been an increase or any lung cancer tied with radon from a basement. And if you look into radiation, it's really quite fascinating. And I recommend to everyone that story at the top of Junk Science, because it sort of encapsulates everything I've done on Junk Science for the last 33 years. I have a very good friend who's a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And I've known him for a long time, and he has doggedly pursued this question of radiation risk and the linear no threshold model. And he has it's really an incredible story. He put together 11 hours. There's an 11-hour video of him. It's broken up into about 20 half-hour segments, describing how this science fraud goes back 90 years, involves the awarding of a Nobel Prize, and eventually the adoption by EPA of this linear no threshold model, which assumes that if something causes cancer at very high doses, then any exposure can cause cancer. and there's no science behind this, it's just an assumption, but this is how EPA regulates radiation and chemicals. And it's a very powerful weapon that EPA has. And there's never been any science to it. It is something that militates against nuclear power plants. It's why it's so expensive to build nuclear power plants. It's why we cannot clean up nuclear waste sites. It's all based on fear. And if there's ever a dirty bomb that goes off, or if something goes wrong at a nuclear plant, this irrational fear we have of radiation just causes panic. And the most recent nuclear accident we had was in Japan in 2000, I believe it was 2010, the Fukushima plant. 1,000 people died, but not because of the radiation, but because of the panic induced by the evacuation. So this whole linear no threshold model is something, and so what I have in my story is how EPA is intentionally ignoring the science, trying to deep six the science so that it can keep its regulatory power that it has through the linear no threshold model. That's a lot.
It has a certain ring to it. Are you familiar with the term Gell-Mann amnesia?
No.
So Michael, the late physician, Michael Crichton, and a science writer and novelist, I think he did Jurassic Park, amongst others. And he's got a kind of a climate book, which is
State of Fear.
Probably, 30 years old, I think, 1993 or so, but really should be reread today because that's where we're living. We're living in a state of fear. So Michael Crichton came up with the term Gell-Mann amnesia because he had read an article by Murray Gell-Mann, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, I believe. And Murray Gell-Mann said, I was reading an article about nuclear physics or something in the New York Times, and the guy knows absolutely squat, nothing about this topic, and he's writing, he's expounding, and he's recommending, And then Gell-Mann said, but I go to some other article, and it's about, I don't know, some virus in raccoons, whatever, and I'm assuming that guy knows more about that than the guy talking about my topic knew about mine. And so it's Gell-Mann. So Crichton came up with Gell-Mann amnesia, where when you see something about your own topic, you're like, oh my God, these guys got it totally wrong. It's like if you watch, when I see, doctors on TV, they got better, mind you, but early on, you see doctors on TV and they all have the stethoscope backwards, the wrong side, whatever. And it's like, and so you're like, well, these guys know nothing about this. But you don't. But everything else that passes through, you just assume they're knowing something. But you should assume the equal level of competence throughout. And
yes. So no, this is a great point. I made this point last year. You might remember the air apocalypse that happened in New York City, the Canadian wildfires, the skies turned yellow and orange. And so some of my favorite doctors, Marty McCary, Nicole Sapphire, on Fox, would get on and talk about how dangerous the air is. And of course, they have a lot of credibility because they were right on COVID. But, as right as they were on COVID is as wrong as they were on air pollution because they know nothing about it. They didn't believe the experts on COVID, but for some reason they believe the experts on air pollution, air quality, which they, and it's just shocking to me. I'm
sorry, we're having the same thing happening with the, I've been involved in the anti-lockdown movement. I was a member of PAND and I write for brownstone.org. And I have, various articles on Dr. Fauci and EcoHealth Alliance, Donald McNeil in the New York Times. And I have a book on the Zika pandemic prior to that. I apologize for the diversion, but what we're seeing now is that a lot of our allies in that who are expert on the anti-lockdown and how absurd COVID, what I call the Hamassacre came along in October, Hamas versus Israel. And we have a huge bunch of experts from the anti-lockdown world, and they've garnered, hundreds of thousands of millions of followers on Twitter, and they're expounding, and it's like, only half of them are right. It's a whole nother divide. This expertise does not necessarily carry over and give you, well founded rationale on these other topics, in my humble opinion.
No, it's true. No, it's true. It's really unfortunate that so scientists have compartmentalized themselves, and they may know their own area really well, and you're lucky if they do. But when they get into other areas, they're really just seem to me to be man on the street. They really know nothing about anything. They cannot extrapolate their own experiences into other fields, and it's really disturbing.
All right, so let's kind of continue to unravel the raveling of the radiation, the thing with which you have the most, no pun intended, the most exposure.
Well, so this story goes back to the 1920s, when scientists had the idea that maybe background radiation could explain evolution. Their theory was that background radiation, may actually affect the genome and cause evolution. And of course, that turned out not to be true. But these people had then spent so much time on this topic, they weren't going to let it go away, let their funding go away, and they just went forward with it. And eventually, scientists like Herman Muller developed this notion that radiation was causing disease and cancer, and did so in a linear way, so that if something happened at a very high dose, then that would also happen at some rate at a lower dose. And eventually, in 1946, Herman Muller was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work in radiation, even though he had found out a month or two before that he had been debunked by very, very high quality scientific work. But he won the Nobel Prize anyway. And this went on into, and the topic became politicized in the 1950s with above ground nuclear testing. Rockefeller Foundation got involved, the oil industry got involved, the government got involved, and there was a lot of money sloshing around for finding risks from radiation, making up risks from radiation, and it just led right into EPA. EPA was formed in 1970. EPA was put in charge of setting radiation safety standards. So, like any good regulatory outfit, they just took the most conservative radiation standards they could and model they could, and have run with it ever since, even though there's absolutely no science behind it. We know, we know that very high exposures to radiation can increase cancer risk. We know this from the atomic bomb survivors. But yes, still, even so, it's not as great as you might think. Of the 200,000 atomic bomb survivors, there have only been hundreds of extra cancers coming out of that population. So while there's a risk, it's not necessarily a great risk. But more importantly, people like my friend Ed Calabrese did that video series we were just talking about. He's a believer in the hypothesis of hormesis, where if you're exposed to a little bit of radiation or a little bit of a pollutant, it actually stimulates your immune system to function better and protect you against disease.
Did you see the actually quite fabulous HBO series Chernobyl?
No, I did not.
Oh, you should, because it's kind of right up your alley. And I think it's it's really not so much, although Chernobyl is the star. It's really much more about the Soviet method.
Yes.
of dealing with information they don't like, and it is extrapolatable to what we see here. We're not quite Soviet, but bureaucracies are bureaucracies, and they have their own method, and it's not necessarily to the benefit of the people. I mean, Soviet is the people's. Soviet is really the same terminology as the People's Republic of China. The Soviet was these people's councils. So the Soviet Union is basically the same term. And the idea is that it's the people together, and the people are doing this, and it's kind of democratic, blah, blah, blah. And of course, obviously, over time, it turned out to be quite the opposite. And so there's two themes about Chernobyl that I think are very, very important. And it's maybe an 8 or 10 episode series, well worth your time though. But the major point is that the bureaucracy acts totally inimical to what would be the safety of the people there and the people, regionally throughout Europe and whatnot, who might get plumes and so forth from Chernobyl. And everything was kind of counter to what should have happened, aside from the fact that the plans for the plant itself, because it's Soviet, they skimped and they did what they could and they got it up in time and whatnot. But there's one aspect to it that really caught me. My background, I'm science-y also. I was a chemistry and physics major at Yale before I went to medical school, and I taught organic chemistry off and on during my medical school, coming back for the summers. But so I like science, and I like debunking science, and I think like the Gell-Mann amnesia thing, I see a lot of silliness around afoot. But the one silliness, the thing I think they got vastly wrong in Chernobyl is one guy gets exposure to the to the core, whatever, and he's got a radiation sickness, and his wife comes to see him in the hospital, and there's nothing on him per se. He's sick and his skin is blistering, blah blah blah. Yep. And then she gets sick secondarily from having met him in the hospital, as if he had turned into uranium. So it's kind of what I call the cooties theory, and they run with that. And I don't, people kind of lambaste them online, and Reddit and whatnot, but it didn't really get out the same way. The truth, tries to get its pants on when the lies travel the world. And so it was it wasn't the most watched series on Earth, but it's probably the most watched series on Chernobyl. But I think there are a lot of problems, and I think they did it for the greater good, so people could be leery and wary of nuclear power plants. And the author, I think that the Chernobyl comes out as a kind of right of center proviso against government,
Yes.
against bureaucracy and whatnot. But the author of the series and the showrunner is on the left. And he intended it to be an answer, kind of like 3 Mile Island, whatever that movie was with the China Syndrome or something like that. He wanted China Syndrome too, and get people away from nuclear power. So I think that scene was stuck in for that purpose. So to that end, I actually stayed in, we call it Fukushima, but in Japan they call it Fukushima. I stayed in the city of Fukushima about 6-7 years ago, and actually stayed with a elderly retired school teacher and family, and talked with him about their perception of what things were. And that they obviously want to promote the town and it was a completely normal city. Nobody was running around with 3 heads or 5 eyes, as far as I could tell. But maybe you can talk about kind of the aftermath of Fukushima, and how it has played out in our kind of energy choices and how it ripples through government today.
Well, so there's this anti-nuclear crowd, and they've been, since nuclear testing, they've been latching on whatever sort of radiation scare they could find to stop nuclear power. They didn't like the dropping of the atomic bombs. They don't like anything nuclear. They didn't like nuclear testing. So that's where this linear no threshold model that we've been talking about really, got traction with atmospheric nuclear testing. And then, nuclear plants started exploding not exploding, but being built. Construction exploded in the 50s and 60s. And they were doing great until 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island was an accidental release of some water vapor that had some radiation in it. It was not dangerous, but it happened at the same time that China Syndrome came out. So people got really afraid of nuclear power. There was no reason for it. Then along came Chernobyl, and as you alluded to, the problem with Chernobyl was the Soviet Union, and they built things cheaply. And then when something went wrong, they tried to cover it up, and it was just a disaster. But it was not the disaster that was forecast. People said that 1 million people might die from cancer, and that was nothing close to that came true. And then I believe that until Fukushima, I can't think of any nuclear accidents, serious nuclear accidents. And once again, with Fukushima, the problem was the construction of the plant was not done correctly. They didn't foresee the tsunami. Their backup generators were not high enough, and so the tsunami, prevented backups that would have prevented the meltdown. That said, the entire surrounding population was terrified because nuclear accident, and people are just terrified about radiation, and they think that it's going to cause mutations and cancer and these things. Of course, radiation, even among atomic bomb survivors, there's no evidence of any mutations, or birth defects or anything like that. So people got scared, and in the panic, there were 1,000 people who died. And today, the fear of radiation is hampering the cleanup of Fukushima, and it has caused Germany to close all its nuclear plants, even though Germany's terribly worried about global warming. They've shut down their best source of emission-free energy, and it's just and it all goes back to this linear no threshold model and this irrational fear of radiation that we have. And so this story that I have at the top of Junk Science, I put there last summer, and I'm just going to leave it there because it's the most important story in science today. And for some reason, people just really not glomming onto it yet. Not enough people.
Yeah, I popped this up so people could see it. Maybe I assume Professor Calabresi's face is not part of the graph per se. If you have a certain low dosage,
Yeah.
you turn into him. But could you just kind of go over the dotted lines? I mean, obviously there's some baseline radiation we get just by our
Sure.
big nuclear reactor in the sky. What do we call it? The sun or something like that.
Well, we are exposed to background radiation from radiation from space, cosmic radiation, but also the soils and the rocks and our building materials. They all emit radiation, and this is the background radiation that humanity has evolved with, and so it's just background, doesn't hurt anybody. All the places that have higher background radiation actually have populations that live longer. So, and this feeds into Calabresi's theory about hormesis. But the graph, so you can see the dotted lines. That represents areas where EPA, for example, assumes there's a cancer risk, even though there is no data. The solid line over known effects, that is where we have, say, data from the atomic bomb survivors. We know that people that were closest to the explosion had increased risk of leukemia. And that's really what we know. There are other data sets out there of people who have been very highly exposed to radiation, and they have an slightly increased risk of cancer. But in the vast majority of radiation exposures that we are, X-ray, dental X-rays, medical X-rays, TSA screening, other exposures, it lies into this dotted line. And there's no data that shows that there's any risk, but EPA assumes that there is.
Right. So at the risk of getting sued by Michael Mann, this could very well be a hockey stick. Kind of the hockey stick turned actually the way you use it in hockey, not the way that it was on that graph. But it could very well. I don't know if people are going to see my mouse here, but it could very well be that the risk is low when the radiation is low, and then it gets higher. This straight line is a theory. This is not a fact.
It's right.
It hasn't been backed up by data.
Right.
And, I understand at higher risk, you turn into, your hair turns gray and you get a mustache. But
so the interesting thing is, if you look at the actual atomic bomb survivor data, you get what's we call J curve.
Right. So hockey,
where sort of the middle of those dots actually goes below.
Right. So that's where my mouse was. My little mouse cursor was trying to be. I could use my finger; it's not going to show up. But it could very well be that it's low, 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 and then goes up like that.
Yeah.
And so it'd be a guy ready to do a slap shot. But
Although I would say it's more like a field hockey stick than a hockey stick.
Yeah, we're going to go for complete accuracy here. I'll sue you if you say the wrong kind of stick. Uh, all right, so I don't know where to go from that. Maybe actually. So my other pet theory is asbestos. Now I know just a tiny bit about this, and so no pun intended, but I have a very particulate knowledge of asbestos. My knowledge is as best as I could figure out in this short time. But my understanding is that there are three types of at least three types of elemental asbestos, and there's kind of basically a fibrous crystal, and then there are kind of smaller crystals, and you can by grinding and whatnot get some of the fibrous ones to be particulate. And so this is a little bit where kind of my science and physics merges with my medical. So everyone thinks that asbestos causes cancer. It doesn't cause cancer. It causes mesothelioma, which is cancer-like. It's actually more like a tuberculosis kind of thing. Tuberculosis grows as granulomas because the central core, when we try to kill a tuberculin bacterium, it kills the macrophages. So the guys who try going there to eat it, they get poisoned and they die, and they make a kind of a pussy blob, and then eventually it gets encapsulated, forms this granuloma. And in asbestosis, mesothelioma, it keeps growing. So every time the macrophages come and try to eat the asbestos, they get poisoned, and they keep throwing more soldiers at it, and it comes into this big blob and whatnot. But anyway, in order to get deep enough into the lungs, it has to be tiny. It has to be particulate, because we filter stuff out through our nose and then
Right.
the bronchial pathway and whatnot, and it just can't get down big enough if it's one of these fibrous crystals. It doesn't lodge deeply enough into the lung to cause this reaction. And so the asbestosis has been primarily amongst those who mine it and grind it. So the Navy had people on board who were grinding asbestos down to fit as the ship might get hit or whatever, and they needed to put it in new places and build as they go. But the stuff's just sitting in your basement or along the girders of the World Trade Center originally was the fibrous variety, because that's the type that was woven into this kind of woolly asbestos that people think of as the insulation. And but just sitting there wrapped is not going to filter up through anything and if it did, it's not going to get into your nostrils deeply enough to cause mesothelioma. I don't know if any of that kind of accords with your knowledge of the topic, but it seems to me that it's a little bit like the linear no threshold model, in that, like, oh, we get it. The miners of asbestos, they had problems, just like the miners of uranium, they had problems. Therefore, wherever we see this stuff, it's icky, bad, super, no good, and we must get rid of all of it at the expense, mind you, of getting rid of fire retardation. And in the case of the World Trade Center, it still would have fallen down, but it might have taken a couple hours longer and time to get people out of the buildings, for instance. There's a little bit of pushback on that, but I don't know if you've had any thoughts about the asbestos aspect.
Well, sure. So there's three types of asbestos: brown, blue, and white. And it's a matter of what you're exposed to and how much. And as you pointed out, like shipyard workers from World War II, they were exposed to a lot of asbestos, got a lot of mesothelioma. Today, we still use asbestos, although EPA is trying to ban it. But we use a pretty, I think, fairly inert form of asbestos, chrysotile white asbestos, and it's used in like brake linings, things like that, maybe water, producing chlorine for water purification, and it's used safely and there's no harm. But EPA is banning it anyway, because all you have to do to scare people is say asbestos. As far as the World Trade Center, I wrote a very very well-known column at the time on foxnews.com a couple of days after the World Trade Center. You're absolutely right. Parts of the World Trade Center were fireproofed with asbestos, and then because of the asbestos scare, they stopped fireproofing the building. Had they fireproofed it all the way up, no one would have been harmed by the fireproofing, and those buildings may have lasted. No one knows for sure, because no one knows for sure. No one can know for sure. But people thought that asbestos would have helped those buildings stay erect a little more and a little longer so more people could have gotten out. It's, all hypothesis and conjecture. But there was no reason to stop using asbestos. Asbestos was a huge issue in the early 1980s, 1990s. Places like New York, they were ripping asbestos out of schools, of course, and causing more problems than were needed. The asbestos was perfectly safe in the schools. It was not harming anybody. But just the fact that it was there, drove the activists to demand that it be ripped out. And of course, by ripping it out, you increase costs, increase risk to people, because that's when the fibers become airborne. And so that program was abandoned, but not before it caused lots of problems and cost lots of money.
So I highlighted the eminent Stephen Milloy's note here. We may now be paying a horrible price for junk science-fueled asbestos hysteria. Now, I think if you get rid of the word asbestos, you can do the COVID
Yes.
phenomenon.
Yes.
And
yeah. So for COVID was really kind of what happened during COVID was no surprise to me, because I have been involved in this public health, fighting the public health establishment for 33 years. I mean, they are politicized, corrupt, incompetent people. That what happened during COVID happened. I'm like, yes, I believe this is happening. I mean, I can't believe it, but it is happening. So that was just no surprise to me.
My friend and twice interviewee, Mark Changizi, I don't know if you are familiar with him. He's on, there's this thing called x.com. You and I are both on. He's great. He's, I think, physics based, PhD, and he debunks a lot of bad science, and he's been very prominent during COVID. But he has a tweet. I mean, other people have had it, but recently I saw his version of this, where Francis Collins, aforementioned Jay Bhattacharya's formerly very much admired scientist, and not so much after COVID, because he militarized the bureaucracy, the CDC, NIH, NIAID, against the Great Barrington Declaration, and wanted only the government's point of view to be out there. So they basically did censorship and they did malfeasance. He comes out, and he's apparently, I guess, a quasi religious man. He goes to church, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But he says, we did not have any, how does he say it? We went all guns a-blazing against COVID. We did not think of the cost benefit analysis. It was only get rid of all COVID at any cost. And of course, this is a silliness. I at the risk of boring you, I had a dream, a nightmare that was it was hugely vivid, more real than this. And like 30, 40 years ago, where I was in a hot place, and I had this lion tamers kind of thing, a whip and whatnot. There was a block of ice, and it was steaming. And my job was to keep the ice from melting. So I was trying to cajole it and yell at it and whip it and whatnot, but it was melting because it was boiling hot outside. So it almost like the Sisyphusian aspect, they wanted to contain a respiratory virus with amongst humanity. And mind you, if it had been the zombie apocalypse, I get it, but it was never that. The Diamond Princess was Dr. Fauci knew at the time that it hadn't killed everybody. It hadn't killed anybody by the time they did all the restrictions. And that was like a month and a half prior. And so Collins knew, I presume, as well as Fauci did, that the Diamond Princess showed COVID to be, a bad cold, bad flu, and bad for elderly, 80-year-olds and whatnot, but nobody else. And they killed, the world, basically. They just dumped, went in guns a-blazing. And not only that, but they quashed and stymied and could, defamed and attacked the people who said anything else. And that's the essence of this Missouri versus Biden / now Murphy versus Missouri case. But we see this over and over again. It's like it does not seem as if they are working in our best interests. It's adversarial, and they're working their own, and they have these conceptions. They don't understand risk benefit. So a guy who's an epidemiologist finally finds a bug. He gets his 5 minutes or 15 minutes of fame, and he's just going to go nuts over it.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, Collins and Fauci are not stupid people. And they certainly know about cost benefit analysis. I can't explain. I'm not in their heads why they acted the way they did. What they did was very irresponsible, though it was not professional. In the case of Fauci, he first became famous during AIDS, and he knew very well that AIDS was largely a disease spread by sexual contact among homosexual men. It was not a heterosexual disease, but he was out there championing it as a heterosexual disease and scaring everybody to draw attention to it. And so when Fauci became prominent in AIDS, with COVID, I just immediately went back to my AIDS experience and was skeptical of everything he said. And that turned out to be the right way to be, because Fauci had no idea what he was talking about, or at least didn't want to, be close to being right. He just, I can't explain why he did what he did, but he did it, and it was wrong.
Yeah. I have an article on him. Well, maybe I'll pop up. Dr. Fauci's own gain of function, it's called. And the gain of function term is for viruses. Originally, was not what it's used as now. It was basically a yin yang kind of thing. If you tinker with something, frankly, if I fix something on my house, I could have a gain of function house. I could also have a loss of function house. If I make a new door or something like that, I could have something else collapse. So I might have a gain of function in my house by having a new door, but a loss of function because I knocked a beam out. And so it was not really intended to be this augmentation into killer mode and so forth, as the term came to be. But Dr. Fauci and others had their own gain of function on a personal basis. I mean, his wealth, magnified. He gets speaker fees, in six digits right now. And there's a little bit of crossover effect for patents and whatnot, going back to HIV. A lot of these guys get their own gain of function when the disease entity. It's almost as if firemen made more money if there were more fires and bigger fires. And frankly, there's a book on that topic that Bill Clinton supposedly was going to be the guiding force of his administration. I think it's David Osborne. I'm not going to come up with the name of it, but basically the concept there was that you can't have institutions benefit by the thing they're fighting against. So firemen, if they were successful, they get rid of fires, but they make themselves obsolete. I think it's called reinventing government or something like that. And so they never have it in their interest to fully get rid of fires, because then there would be no need for firemen. And so if the NIH somehow got rid of all diseases, if the Susan Komen Foundation got rid of all breast cancer, then there'd be no and so all the people who work there. I mean, this came out on a personal basis. I used to do these disability exams as part of my primary practice, kind of an adjunct, and I did it both for the state and for the military. And people come in, and for the state ones, they were local, so I got to see them again. And people come in, they might have a bad pinky, whatever, but they could do other jobs, and I would write it up very matter of factly and whatnot. And they come in and they say, thank you, Dr. Bach, thank you for letting me get the disability. I'm like, oh, you're welcome. But it's like, I go back to the report. It's like nothing I said recommended disability, but the disability groups, at the state, their jobs are giving that disability. And they make themselves more useful by having more people on the rolls. And we see this, kind of the way that, the war on poverty, poverty has won. There's kind of like a feeding that you would run out of the bureaucracy that does these things if they're, in part, it's good to keep the people, in a certain state of need so that you can be helping if your job is the helper.
So that's right. And my big experience in what you're saying is EPA. So 50, 60 years ago, our environment was not as clean as it could have been. The rivers caught on fire, and there was, very often air pollution episodes. And so Richard Nixon combined all the federal environmental functions into EPA. And, with this renewed focus on the environment and all the wealth and technology we have, we cleaned up our air and water pretty quickly. By the time, as a matter of fact, by the time I started working in this area in 1990, I think the environment was pretty well cleaned up. Yet the EPA, is saying that the world is more dangerous than ever. It's getting bigger budgets, more staff. We are now to the point where EPA's main concern is chasing the invisible, odorless plant food known as carbon dioxide. And a friend of mine just told me that he was in a meeting with EPA where EPA was considering whether to declare sunlight a pollutant because it warmed up bodies of water.
Well,
So
they're doing that. There are things afoot where they want to like bury trees to hide the carbon dioxide, and they want to like put clouds, kind of these particulate clouds in the sky to block the sun. I mean, these
right.
are.
And my big thing with EPA is fine particulate matter. You think of it as soot and dust in the air. And EPA has completely invented this as essentially the most deadly substance on Earth, where any inhalation of particulate matter, we're just talking about soot and dust, pollen, any inhalation can kill you within hours. And EPA has pushed the WHO, the World Health Organization, on to estimate that 1 in 7 deaths in the world, about 8 million people a year, are killed by particulate matter. It's total BS. There's absolutely nothing to it. Yet EPA, because of all the money it hands out, hands out billions of dollars to researchers. They all confirm, EPA's beliefs.
Yeah. I think this kind of refers back to polytheistic societies, where you have a shrine, you have a god, and then you have to pledge fealty and bring sacrifices and gifts to the god, and hang wreaths and so forth around it. I think we invent them, and then we just have a hard time getting rid of them.
Yeah.
Just to kind of backtrack slightly, I'm going to put up the Mark Changizi. I don't know if the picture shows up or not, but there's a video under there. So it's Francis Collins, former director of the NIH, admits, and frankly, this is almost, if this were a war, this is almost like a war crime. Admits that public health put infinite. This is a word. Are you familiar with this word? Infinite weight on stopping COVID. No cost-benefit analysis, no civil liberties. Putting infinite weight on just one thing is what death cults do. That's this is Mark Changizi's comment on this. And if the picture shows up, I mean, you can't really see him; it's black. But here he is over on the side, this is a horror. I mean, this is a total horror show. And frankly, horror movies are made of this, where you go nuts over one thing.
Yeah. So now we've sort of moved on from COVID. They're landing on carbon dioxide and industrial emissions, and they want to treat industrial emissions the same way. And so if there's something bad going on in the world, it's because of emissions. And they want to go from COVID lockdowns to climate lockdowns. We have a president who now says that the slight global warming that may be occurring is actually worse than nuclear war. Al Gore gets away with saying that global warming is like 600,000 atomic bombs going off in the atmosphere every day. I mean, this is crazy stuff. Yeah, but the media keeps repeating it and putting it in people's heads.
Yeah, no, there's a list of the predictions, and it's crazy. The predictions just keep coming. The hits keep coming. There might be the equivalent of 6,000 nuclear bombs going off in Al Gore's head. And one of these cui bono things. I mean, he's had gain of function, not just in terms of his girth, but he's had huge gain of function from the inconvenient truth and going on this. And I think it is certain cult-like aspects to it in religion. And again, similar to Collins, whatnot. We're kind of rounding out the hour, and I'd like to give you a little bit of a pump. So I'm going to pop up your book here, Air Pollution, Scare Pollution. Can you tell us a little bit about this, when this came out, and why people should read it, or at least buy it?
So I just mentioned this a few minutes ago. EPA has invented particulate matter, fine particulate matter, PM2.5, as the most toxic substance known to man. And so scare pollution is basically the story of how it has used particulate matter, turned it into this incredible regulatory weapon. And we're seeing it today. The Biden administration is using particulate matter to crack down on, to actually implement its climate agenda. So I think it's a very interesting read. It's basically the story of my career. I've worked on this for more than 30 years now, and it is just an incredible story.
Well, I have not read it, so I'm going to have to take your word on it. How can I trust you?
Read it. Well, I think the book is only $11 or something like that. It's pretty cheap.
Yeah. So, what's the take-home message, and how do people get involved with junk science, and how can they help you?
Well, follow me on X at Junk Science. Buy the book. I think the book is a fantastic read. It's I've uncovered EPA doing illegal human experiments on children as young as 10 years old, which caused a real uproar at EPA, the National Academy of Science. It's just it's a very interesting book. You want to see how EPA actually works.
Mm-hmm. So here we have you're on climate here. I guess Elon Musk commented on this. Can you tell us what this NOAA is? The National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, something like that?
Yeah. So until the global warming hoax is that emissions cause warming. Well, if you look at the actual data, it's really these El Niños we've been experiencing since 1980, and every time there's an El Nino, there's like a step up in warming, a slight step up, and then temperatures are steadier, start decreasing until the next El Nino. So the last time we had warming was 2015, 2016, when we had an El Nino. And so I merely pointed out that, we had 8 or 9 years of no warming because there had been no El Nino. And I predicted that, in 2023, if there was an El Nino, which looked like we were lining up to have, there would be warming. And of course, there has been. But it's caused by the El Nino, not by emissions. And so that was just a tweet I had at the time. I think it got like 13 million views. It did very well. Even Elon Musk commented on it. So,
right. This graph shows really no flux. The y-axis is what, temperature?
Yes, it's the temperature anomaly from a baseline.
Right. So
between 2015 and 2023, there had been no warming, as you can see. I mean, just the trend was actually down. It was actually cooling, even though we had 450 billion tons of emissions. Now we are told every day that every emission causes warming. Well, if that's true, where's the warming? Where was the warming?
Right. Well, I mean, it's kind of like a self-cleaning oven. I mean, more CO2. Plants are happier. I mean, literally in a greenhouse. People call it the greenhouse effect, but greenhouses not only kind of sequester, or try to have greater light. They bring heat, but people forget there's probably higher CO2 in there. I'm not sure of that. I've got to think about that. But actually, the side point I want to ask is cause and effect. This idea came to me. I must have seen something to prompt it, because I'm not going to take credit for it. But all along we think higher carbon dioxide levels bring greater warmth. But there's the thing, Boyle's law, getting back to this inconvenient truth of physics, which is we've all seen when we have a hot can of soda, Coca-Cola or something like that. When the can's cool, you open it, you get that little pop. But if you leave the can out in the sun and it gets warm, you open it, the thing sprays out. Well, what is that? Well, the carbon dioxide is bicarbonate. That's the bubbles in the soda. At higher temperature, the carbon dioxide is less soluble in the water. Yeah. So, how much of the carbon dioxide, high levels of carbon dioxide, greater warmth might just be that greater warmth for whatever reason. Let's say the big nuclear power plant in the sky. Yes. Raises water temperatures, and then we have more CO2 in the atmosphere because it's kind of bubbling out like the soda can.
Yeah. So last year I highlighted this study that was published in Health Physics. It was a very popular, several tweets. And these guys did carbon-14 dating of CO2 in the atmosphere and reported that only about 10% the CO2 that is in the atmosphere since 1750 is man-made. I mean, the rest is from nature. And of course, that makes sense because the Earth has been most recently warming since about 1650, the bottom of the Little Ice Age. And that warming has caused more plant growth and increased, boosted the carbon cycle. And of course, with a boosted carbon cycle, you're going to have more CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's really been a boon for humanity because we need food. CO2 is good for agriculture, and we need the food. People fail to realize that before industrialization, there were fewer than 1 billion people on the planet. Life was short, brutal, and nasty. And then, thanks to industrialization and emissions and whatever warming we've had, we've gone from less than 1 billion to more than 8 billion, and 8 billion people living longer, healthier, wealthier, freer lives than ever before. And this is, for Greens, this is some sort of horror. For the rest of us, is great.
Yeah, it's not my term of art, but there's a thing called when liberal pieties collide. And so you see the oddities of all the people like green, save this, insulate your house, leaving the at my squash and tennis club, leaving the doors open all winter, like heating the outside, running the furnace and so forth, and pouring big bad oil in to keep the place warm on the inside while they're having the windows and doors open so they can breathe fresh air because of the big bad coronavirus. It's like, and this still goes on. I mean, and then all the people who don't want, trash and whatnot, they throw their masks away. And where do these things go? And what are they made out of? How much plastic, and birds, presumably they don't want the little things on the soda cans, but they throw all their masks away and, get wrapped around birds. I pick up trash. I'm an eco-conservative. I'm a conservative politically. But when I walk around the neighborhood, I tether the dog to my waist and I have a grabber and I just pick up trash because I don't like looking at trash. I can't tell you, I'm not joking. I've literally picked up thousands of masks and they're all tied up. Even today, they're tied up on the twigs and branches along the little creek. Whatnot, the water comes up and it's only, these branches are only filtering out probably 1% of all the ones that pass through into the Charles River and the ocean and whatnot. And it's like, but it never matters. They're on to the next thing. And so it's always a moving target. Anyway, any final words before I give myself a little self-promotion?
Well, I just, I think a junk science issue that's going to come up in the next 6 months is coming up right now. We have Robert Kennedy running for president, and he is trying to make a political issue out of chronic disease, saying that there's more chronic disease than ever, and it's because of the food we eat. And Robert Kennedy, who knows nothing about the environment or food or health or anything like that, he was right on COVID, but he's just a leftist on everything else. And his vice presidential running mate, Nicole Shanahan, who is a 38-year-old lawyer whose, I guess, claim to fame is married to Sergey Brin, she agrees with Robert Kennedy that food is killing everybody and chronic disease is just running rampant. And it's because,
this is exactly. So I've got a book out now, but one of the books I have to be out, I basically it's like 80% written, is a book on cancer. It's called Dodging Cancer, but really that's not a perfect title. It's really about debunking myths about cancer. It's very similar to what you have. And I've looked for this term out in the internet world, and I'm going to take credit for it because I haven't seen it elsewhere, but I called cancer a disease of success. So this more chronic diseases is like, well, compared to what? I mean, there's a joke. Two data scientists walk down the street. One says, "Hi, how are you?" The other says, "Compared to what?" It's like, compared to what? I mean, you're having more chronic diseases. Well, dude, people live longer. That's a good thing, right? Isn't that what we're all aiming for? And
Right.
Cancer, nobody wants cancer at 5 years old or 12 or 20 or Lance Armstrong or whatever. But if you live forever, you get rid of all other illnesses. Guess what? You're going to die of something somewhere along the line. It's going to be a cancer. So if you get prostate cancer at 98 and die, was that a bad thing? I mean, well, sure, it was. Maybe you could have lived to 99 and died from the flu. But so you have to kind of pick your poison. No pun intended here. But at any rate, so that's.
And so Kennedy's committing the classic sort of junk science, mistake. So he's like, when my uncle was president, only 6% of Americans had chronic disease, and now it's 60%. So, therefore, our
Well,
modern society is killing people. But of course, back then, people didn't live as long as you mentioned. The average age of the population was much lower. There was we didn't have the
yeah.
technology, the
I
sort of
I have an
standard.
article. I have an article in my upcoming book about the absence of cancer in Africa. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, um, or Africa as a whole, pretty much, but there's very low rates of cancer. Well, isn't that awesome? but the median age of death is like 15 years
Yeah,
lower than
and
that in
that's
Japan.
exactly it. That's
And,
exactly
and
it.
so it's like, well, yeah. So the good news is no cancer. The bad news is you get malaria, malnutrition, the elements. I don't know, you name it, war, plague, blah blah blah. So that'll be awesome. If we could bring back the plague or something like that, then you wouldn't have to worry about cancer.
The answer, that's
That,
it.
so here's my plug. It's actually something sort of up your alley. Although, I promise our audience until today we had never met. So this is Zika, the pandemic that never was. You may or not, you might think Zika is that, clear-colored beer, or that was Zima. But, Zika came along as a weird thing. I'd been to medical school and been awake for most of it, and had never heard of Zika. And it turns out it's a dengue virus. There are 4 dengues. They're named 1, 2, 3, and 4, and Zika is really the 5th dengue, but nobody ever counted it because it doesn't give illnesses to humans. It may be chimps or something like that. And so they're all from Africa. Dengue and Zika from Africa. And the bug, the mosquito is Aedes aegypti, which Egypt is in Africa. So it's all African phenomenon. But all of a sudden in 2015, Brazil posited that it was causing microcephaly. And this is my book's kind of a whole wonderland of it's a comedy of errors, kind of Keystone Cops kind of thing, of how probably the wrongful assignment of about 12 or 15 cases of microcephaly in one city in Brazil, Recife, northeast Brazil, and where ordinarily there'd be about 7 cases based on their wrong criterion of what is and is not microcephaly at the time. So they probably saw about double the cases at one point in August. August, and totally separately, people had been looking for a new virus in northeast Brazil. They'd been looking for chikungunya so that they could bring money and attention to the poor northeast of Brazil, which is hotter, more tropical, less wealthy than Rio and Sao Paulo and so forth. And so they wanted a new virus to be there. They formed a group called CHIKV, the Mission, Chikungunya Virus, the Mission, named after the 1986 Robert De Niro movie. And literally, not making this up. And lo and behold, they didn't find chikungunya, but somebody thought he found Zika. But it's really impossible to say because no Zika tests. And it basically Zika is a dengue and blah, blah, blah. And there had been dengues, but dengue had never caused microcephaly. Anyway, and then so somebody from part 1 happened to be in the town where part 2 happened and said, this is new and that's new. Therefore, A causes B. And we had Zika microcephaly, leaked it to the press. There was panic. And then huge number outpouring of cases, world thing. The WHO called it a PHEIC, which is sort of a pandemic public health emergency of international concern, and so forth. And it was kind of something that should have been debunked right away, and it has never been. And to your earlier points about the bureaucracy, there are billions of dollars currently being spent on Zika, and there's been no Zika microcephaly anywhere on Earth, even in northeast Brazil in 2016 even, and beyond. So nobody else talks about this thing, and I can't get an audience anywhere in the academy. I've sent it out to literally 1,000 people whose names are tagged to Zika articles, and it's a shame there should be 1,000 Zika articles, but there's actually more. But the thing, probably A never caused B, and Zika is real. It's a real virus. Microcephaly is a real phenomenon. It just so happens that one doesn't cause the other, and you could just as easily talk about windows and sparrows, and tie those 2 words together, come up with some phenomenon. It's just totally almost 2 random words put together, Zika microcephaly. But there you have it. And so I'm looking for any kind of help in spreading the word. And if you don't have to plug.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to read your book. I remember at the time, before anyone was really aware of what you just described, the obvious solution was just to kill the mosquitoes, mosquitoes have killed more people than any agent ever. And we should just kill the mosquitoes, and we have the pesticide technology to do it, but we don't do it because people, of course, are afraid of pesticides.
Yeah. Well,
Go
that's an
figure.
interesting point. I don't want to do that. It's like the feather that turns, you go back in history and kill Adolf Hitler and something else happens. But it's like I'm not sure I don't know what the ramifications of getting rid of all mosquitoes would be. But
Well, we don't have to get rid of mosquitoes. I mean, they're a major part of the food chain. Okay, so I don't think, but you can, we have a fine environment in the United States, and we don't really have any mosquitoes.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that kind of caps off our hour. I appreciate talking with you. I enjoyed it, and look forward to speaking with you again. And I recommend people follow up with you at Steve Milloy on Twitter and buy your book and so forth.
All right, Randall, thanks for having me.